All right, everybody ready? Okay. All right, good afternoon. As you know, I'm Bob Gualtieri, Pinellas County Sheriff, and we're here this afternoon to talk about the arrest of Robert Brian Thomas of Niles, Michigan, for a rape that occurred here in Pinellas County 21 years ago, and another rape that occurred in Venice, Florida, the same year in 1998. Also with me here today is Florida Department of Law Enforcement Tampa Special Agent in Charge, Mark Brunell, and FDLE Tampa Chief of Forensic Service, Donna Wallace. And I'm going to go through this. It is complicated. It does take a little while to go through it, but it's important to have an appreciation for what happened and to have the full picture and perspective of this. On October 9th, 1998, 21 years ago, deputies responded to a sexual battery call in Indian Rocks Beach. The rape occurred at the 12th Avenue Beach access, a little bit west of Gulf Boulevard. The victim, back then in 1998, was a 20-year-old female who reported that she had been walking alone on Indian Rocks Beach when she was approached by an unknown naked male. This unknown naked male asked the victim for a cigarette, and the 20-year-old female attempted to run away. The naked male chased the woman down, caught her, and took her to the ground. He ordered her to keep her eyes closed and threatened her with a weapon. The naked male then vaginally raped the woman and forced her to perform oral sex on him. The suspect left DNA in the victim. The rapist forced the victim into the Gulf of Mexico and ordered her to clean herself before he fled the area. Detectives from the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office responded to that scene back in 1998, and a sexual assault victim exam, or SAVE exam, was conducted with DNA evidence of the rape obtained from the victim and her clothing. At that time in 1998, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement processed DNA submissions from the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office. Since that time today, we have our own DNA lab here in Pinellas County through the medical examiner's office. But we continue with this case for a variety of reasons using the FDLE lab. And as I said, that's where the original submission was made. The FDLE lab developed a DNA profile of the attacker. That DNA profile was uploaded into national, state, and local databases, but back then, no matches were found. So what that means is that the person who committed the rape had not had his known DNA collected at some point prior to the query, and it was not in the national, state, or local databases. DNA collection began in Florida in 1994, and the collection process has evolved with collection occurring more and more, meaning from more and more people ever since. DNA is collected at the jail when someone is arrested and or at the time of conviction in court. As of January 1st of 2019, under the evolving Florida statutes on the collection of DNA evidence, DNA is now collected anytime anyone is arrested on any felony charge and booked into the jail, as well as some misdemeanor charges, including stalking, voyeurism, and others. In May of 1999, so shortly after this case, FDLE matched the DNA from our case here in Indian Rocks Beach in Pinellas County with DNA taken from a victim of a rape in Venice, Florida. That rape in Venice also occurred in 1998. The circumstances of the Venice rape were different in that the victim was sleeping at a location where the suspect broke in and raped the victim. This began a 2-decade effort to identify the suspect. For the next 20 years, various detectives from the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office and the Venice Police Department worked to identify the suspect. In 1999, the Sanibel Police Department informed the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office that they had a recent rape in their city that may be related because the circumstances of the rapes were similar to the beach rape that occurred here in Pinellas. However, in that Sanibel case, there was no DNA evidence. Detectives also learned that the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office had a 1996 rape that may also have been related because of circumstances But again, in the Sarasota Sheriff's Office case, there was no DNA. By comparing DNA and other evidence from the 4 rapes, Sanibel, Sarasota, Venice, Pinellas, detectives worked for several years to identify a suspect. In the course of that investigation over several years, detectives identified about 90 different people of interest, but through investigative work and DNA lab submissions, all 90+ people were eliminated as suspects in the Pinellas and Venice rapes, the rapes for which we had DNA. During the course of the investigation, detectives also submitted DNA to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to conduct what's called a familial search. One type of DNA search is taking a DNA sample, loading the DNA profile in the national, state, and or local databases, and determining whether there's a match. So that's taking an unknown, putting it in where you've got knowns, and seeing if you can match it up. Another type of DNA analysis is taking the DNA from a known suspect and comparing it to the DNA that you have that was taken from the victim. And that would be a direct analysis. But both of these searches are directly seeking the identity of the person who committed the crime. A familial search also checks the databases, that national, local, state database, but seeks to identify someone who is not the suspect, but shares certain close genetic markers to the suspect. This type of search is looking for a very close relative, like a parent or a child of the suspect. That familial search, in this case, also did not yield any positive results. This case was assigned to Detective Chris Lyons of our cold case unit in 2017, and he initiated a meeting that occurred in November 2017 with the Venice Police Department and other agencies to review the evidence. Detective Lyons found that the Venice Police Department had possible fingerprints from the suspect in the Venice rape, but they had not been able to fully identify the latent prints. Detective Lyons asked for a copy of those prints and submitted them to a Pinellas County Sheriff's Office latent print examiner, and he identified the person to whom the prints belong upon running them in what's called AFIS, or the Advanced Fingerprint Identification System. This lead looked promising because the victim in the Venice rape told detectives she did not know the identified person, and he had never been identified in the prior 19 years of investigative work leading up to this fingerprint identification. Detectives thought that they were onto the suspect. Despite having fingerprints for this person because of his prior arrests, they thought that we might have had DNA, but his DNA wasn't in the system because his arrest occurred prior to the time that DNA was being collected, as I outlined to you a few minutes ago about the evolution of DNA collection in Florida. So there was no mandatory DNA collection at the time he was arrested for the offenses that he was arrested for. Nonetheless, through some extensive investigative techniques that I'm not going to identify, we were able to obtain a search warrant from a judge to get that person's DNA. Upon DNA lab analysis, the person whose prints were collected in the Venice case was eliminated as the person who committed the rapes. I'm not going to identify that person because he was excluded as a suspect. In February 2018, we were back to square one. We had DNA of the rapist, but no way to identify whose DNA it was. In October of 2018, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement announced a new initiative for DNA genetic genealogy, and FDLE accepted this case in December of 2018 for genetic genealogy mapping. I'm going to explain a little bit about the genetic genealogy process from the investigative perspective, and I'll let Special Agent in Charge Burnell or Ms. Wallace speak in more detail about that methodology in a couple minutes. The short version is that people use services like Ancestry.com and 23andMe and a myriad of others to help them determine their relatives and develop family trees. There are numerous different companies, as I said, that provide the service. People submit their DNA, receive information back from these companies about their relatives and their extended families. As an example, if one person in Florida submits DNA to a provider like Ancestry.com, and another person in California also submits their DNA to the same company, and their DNA matches, they are notified of the familial relationship in the results that each receives. However, if that person in Florida and that person in California use different companies, so one uses Match 23andMe and the other uses Ancestry.com, then they're not going to receive that hit or that match because they're in different databases with different companies. This is where yet another company, such as GEDmatch, GEDmatch, comes in. When a person receives their DNA profile back from a company like Ancestry.com, they can decide themselves to load the profile on GEDmatch. When they load the profile on GEDmatch, GEDmatch informs them that they are sharing that DNA profile with law enforcement, and they can allow that to happen or they can opt out of it. And if they don't opt out of it, then they know that that profile is going to be shared with law enforcement. GEDmatch receives, again, these voluntarily loaded profiles from the myriad of vendors, not just Ancestry.com and 23andMe, but anyone that anyone uses, and then they voluntarily load it onto the GEDmatch system. It's primarily used by people who want to locate birth parents, people who are adopted, unaware of siblings, and to find those family members that they've been looking for a long time. FDLE has an agreement that includes GEDmatch, and under this agreement, it can submit DNA profiles in serious cases like murders and rapes to try and identify someone who may be related to the suspect. So when people load those DNA profiles on GEDmatch, as I said, it is voluntary and it puts it out into public space. Genetic genealogy, when successful, allows investigators to work backward from the identified family member who loaded their DNA profile on GEDmatch to the suspect. There has to be some match at some level, no matter how remote, between the suspect's DNA and the DNA of the person who loaded their profile on GEDmatch. Once the scientific analysis is completed, then FDLE genetic genealogy mapping team goes to work to identify possible suspects. This is only the 5th successful case in Florida and the 4th arrest using genealogy mapping, and this is the first case in Pinellas County or within the 6th Judicial Circuit. As the process began in this case, detectives learned in March of 2019 from FDLE that the chances of a genetic genealogy match were 5 on the solvability scale. A 1 has the highest probability of solvability, and 5 is the least. So the initial information is that you got a slim chance of being successful. But despite this case having a 5 on the solvability scale, detectives and FDLE scientists persevered, and based on a distant match in the open source DNA database, they did obtain a match of a distant relative of the suspect in this case. Just to illustrate how daunting this effort was, what's called a centimorgan, or a cm, is a unit of DNA measurement. It determines how much DNA someone shares with another person. The higher the number, the closer the match. Everyone has 7,000 centimorgan from their mother and father. The match we received was 54.1. So it was very remote between the person who uploaded their DNA on this site and the suspect's DNA. What this meant was the person who loaded their DNA and the suspect shared an ancestor at the great-grandparent level, and it was estimated that the person who loaded their DNA and the rapist were somewhere around 4th cousins. Detectives identified the person who contributed the DNA profile to GEDmatch, and that person lives in Ocala. Detectives traveled to Ocala, met with her and with other family members, and she was cooperative, but we're not going to name her here today. Detectives spent hours with her mapping out her family tree and identifying and contacting additional family members. Now, at the same time, because of the diligent work that was ongoing, detectives also were continuing to go through the case file, continuing to look at evidence, continuing the work, is that they identified a possible suspect based upon a composite that the victim had provided in 1998. The suspect had a rape history from Massachusetts, and there was an outstanding warrant for that person, but the state of Massachusetts would not extradite the person on that rape charge. So they had a composite from 1998. They were able to identify a person by name as a possible suspect. He had a history of rape. He had a warrant for rape, but Massachusetts wouldn't extradite him. That person was also arrested at a time when DNA collection was not required, so we didn't have that person's DNA. Through various covert investigative techniques, we were able to obtain that person's DNA sample. Detectives also interviewed the person, and he denied committing the rape in the Pinellas case or the Venice case. DNA analysis, when it was submitted to FDLE, excluded that person as a suspect in the Venice case and the Pinellas case. However, based upon that submission, is that his DNA was tied to an unsolved rape in Palm Beach County. And that matter has been referred to the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. Based on the interview of the woman in Ocala, detectives were able to identify a woman in Iowa who was part of the extended family genetically and related to the possible suspect. Based on interviews with a woman in Iowa, the detectives identified another family member who lives in Venice, and the family tree of this family revealed a large extended family with members in Illinois, Texas, and Florida. The FDLE genealogy team was able to narrow the suspect to someone within one genetic line of the family. A possible family member suspect was identified as Robert J. Thomas. He's a white male with a date of birth of July 16th, 1977. So it got to a point with the genealogy mapping that FDLE was able to limit it to one line in the family and 5 people within that line. Robert J. Thomas was identified as one of those 5. But because he was in prison, we had his DNA, FDLE conducted the analysis, and he too was eliminated as a suspect. But following the same family line, detectives became aware of Robert Brian Thomas, whose photograph is here to my left, who's now 61 years old, and he is the father of the guy who's in prison who was previously excluded, Robert J. Thomas. So the suspect, Robert Brian Thomas, was also in prison between 2010 and 2012, but due to a processing error, his DNA was not entered into the national databases. So if they hadn't had a processing error in the federal government, is that the DNA samples from the Venice case and from the Indian Rocks Beach case here in Pinellas County, when he was arrested and sent to federal prison back in 2010, they would have hit. And this case would have been solved back then, but for this processing error, and that's something that it happens. We don't really know much about it, but it didn't hit. So when it was not entered, there was nothing else that could be done at that point. But we know from historical records that Robert Brian Thomas lived in the Venice and Sarasota areas from 97 to 99 during the times of the Venice and Pinellas County rapes. Detectives learned that Robert Brian Thomas was currently now living in Niles, Michigan. Detectives were able to obtain a DNA sample from Thomas in Michigan in early December of 2019. On December 10th of 2019, FDLE DNA analysis confirmed that Robert Brian Thomas DNA is a match to the DNA taken from the victims in the Pinellas County 1998 and Venice rape cases. Detectives obtained arrest warrants for Thomas in both cases and traveled to Michigan last Thursday, where they arrested Robert Brian Thomas on armed sexual battery from the 21-year-old case here in Pinellas and from the rape in Venice also in 1998. Our detectives have been in close contact with the victim from the rape case here in Pinellas, and of course, this brings much deserved justice for her. She is greatly relieved that the person who committed this horrible act and violated her as a 20-year-old young woman is now in jail. This case demonstrates how evolving science, technology, collaboration among law enforcement agencies, and good old-fashioned boots-on-the-ground police work come together. The great follow-up and perseverance by detectives of our cold case unit demonstrates the commitment by the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office to thoroughly investigating serious crimes such as rape and persevering even after 21 years to ensure the bad guy is caught and that he is held responsible for these serious bad acts. I want to thank the members of the Venice Police Department for their hard work and partnership to solve these terrible crimes. And I also want to thank the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and its lab team for the great work it did in providing the science that allowed us to put a true bad guy, one who raped at least 2 women, in jail. So with that, I'll turn it over to FDLE for any remarks, and then we'll take any questions that you all have.
Thank you, Sheriff. I just want to echo the Sheriff's comments, and I can't commend the great investigative work by both Venice and Pinellas County Sheriff's Office. Like the Sheriff said, this is old-fashioned good police work. The Genealogy team that we have, which is based in Orlando, has been around for about a year. And what it does, it gives these investigators another tool. It's nothing different than a tip coming in on a tip line. It's just an avenue to focus some investigative techniques, and the real work lies with the detectives out there on the street. It's a great, great case and a great example of teamwork. Thank you.
Anything you want to add at all? No.
You guys did well.
Okay. Any questions? Do you all have any questions? Anything?
I imagine, 20 plus years go by. I would imagine this guy thought he got away with it. What was his reaction when he was arrested?
Yeah, so he was arrested. He left his home. They were doing surveillance up in Niles, Michigan, with the police department up there, and he left his home. He was in a car. They did a traffic stop, and took him into custody, brought him to the police station, conducted an interview with him. He did make statements that were general in nature, but once directly confronted, he refused to talk any further and said he wanted a lawyer. The general statements were that he had been here in Pinellas County around that time. He was working as a contractor. He was around here, but he wouldn't make any admissions. And again, once he was directly confronted, he shut right down. So.
And the victim, did she recognize him? When you showed her the photo, did she have anything to add to that?
No, I don't. I mean, you're making an assumption there. I don't know that we've showed her the photo. So it's, she's been contacted. She's aware an arrest has been made. And again, the arrest is made on probably the strongest of scientific evidence that there is, and that's a complete DNA match between the DNA that was taken from her body based upon the act and his known DNA that was taken up in Michigan.
You talked a little about what maybe her reaction when she heard the news. I can imagine having to go 20 years
Sure.
knowing this person was out there.
Oh, yeah, and relieved that justice was done and that the bad guy's in jail and that this person who violently raped her 21 years ago is in custody and off the street. I mean, it's something that you never get over. It's something that you live with, and as a victim of a crime, you certainly want to see justice and see somebody punished for what they did like that. Again, it was a double rape, if you will, and he really brutalized the woman. And the one down in Venice, and Venice can speak more to that, but that was also a horrific event. What I understand the facts of that were is that the woman was asleep. He had a rope, went in, tied her up, and violently raped her. So you got a guy that is a bad guy who had violated at least two women 21 years ago, and as part of the question a few minutes ago, I'm sure after all this amount of time, thought it was something that he was able to get away with. And it doesn't work that way, and we do persevere, and we're going to keep going and going with all these cases and with all the cold cases, and that's why we have a cold case unit, and that's why we dedicate the resources to it for a whole bunch of reasons, but not the least of which is for the victims, to make sure that we can get justice and we can solve these cases as the facts evolve, and especially as science and technology evolve.
Sheriff, once you found, as if I understand this correctly, the suspect's son,
Right.
did you feel like you were 95% of the way there because the DNA is telling you at that point, hey, you're very, very close,
Well,
in a way that other evidence doesn't tell you that always?
Yeah, and what the genealogy mapping team was able to tell us is that they had narrowed it to one line. So we were somewhere within the right line. So as we're getting closer and closer, but I can tell you over the years, is that there were a lot of times over the years that we thought we were close. I mean, when you get the fingerprints, and the fingerprints are of somebody who hadn't been identified, and you're starting to go down that path, and she doesn't know them, and then you find out no. And then you got the other one where you got the similarities in Sarasota and the Sanibel one. So there's a lot of time over the years where we thought we were close with this, but it wasn't until, of course, this, and getting it narrowed down to, one line with 5 people that we, started having, but, as I say, until it's there, it's not. Until it's over, it's not. And there's a lot of ups and downs with this case over the last 21 years.
When that processing error happened, where was he in prison? Was it
Federal prison.
Federal prison.
Yeah. And those things happen, and I don't know that there's anything to it other than something happened in the collection process. It's not unusual that there are process problems. And again, you're going back now 9 years ago when that happened, and so much was different. I mean, even here in Florida, 9 years ago, you had a very narrow set of offenses that we were even collecting DNA for. It isn't until January 1st of this year that we're now collecting DNA in all felonies. That's just this year, and again, some misdemeanors. So, those things happen, I'll put a lot into that. There are processing errors that happen, and they happen with all kinds of collection. But and again, it was 9 years ago. So.
And do you know what charges he was?
Drug charges. It was cultivation of marijuana. It was a DEA case.
And what about the Sarasota and Sanibel cases?
So as far as I know, because they have no DNA in those cases, there were some similarities, again, factual similarities, beach rape type cases. But there's nothing that we are able to do with those because there's no DNA in those cases.
And where is he being held now?
Right now he's in Michigan, be extradited down.
So he's in a state facility up there?
As far as I know, he is in a county jail.
Sheriff, what do you have to say, we hear from time to time naysayers that feel that law enforcement shouldn't have access to, say, these genealogy websites, what they collect. What is your message?
Well, especially in this set of circumstances is that all of that is a complete non-issue. And it's a complete non-issue because anybody who voluntarily puts in a public space and puts those DNA profiles that they get back from Ancestry.com or 23andMe or whatever the site is, not only are they putting it out in the public space, but those companies that then allow you to, like GenMatch, that allow you to load it on there, is that you are affirmatively giving them permission to share it with law enforcement. So there are no privacy issues, and there are no privacy concerns, and people can opt out of it. So there's no issues. But one of the things, and I forgot to mention it, and it's here, and I do want to mention it, is to show you the amount of work that goes in, and that's the purpose of having this here. The amount of work that goes into the genealogy mapping is that this is a portion of the mapping chart that the FDLE team used in order to go through all of these people. Now, we don't have their names on here because these are people. So, getting, Kate, to your point is you got a woman who's in Ocala. She, for whatever reason, decides she wants to know more about her family, her history, ancestors, the family tree. She gets it. And when she gets that information, she also has a greater interest in trying to maybe find a specific person, maybe a sibling, maybe a biological parent or whatever it is. So these are normal people, law-abiding people, people that have no concern. So when they load it on there and there's an option to share that with law enforcement, maybe to provide justice to a victim, in this case who was raped 21 years ago, why wouldn't you share it? What do you care? And so these people are saying, yeah, we want law enforcement to be able to use this. So she puts it out there, but once she puts it out there, is that the tentacles are huge, they're far, they're wide, because of vast families. And it takes a tremendous, tremendous amount of work by the FDLE mapping team, working in conjunction with the investigators, And it's literally chipping away at this. So we're going, based upon the information, they say, go check with so-and-so. You call so-and-so, you pay him a visit, whether it's in Ocala or Iowa or Texas or wherever it is that you tell me about your family, tell me about these people, tell me about, and then you're going through and you're also using a lot of open source information, everything from obituaries and people being married and all kinds of public records and all kinds of this, the amount of work that goes into this, and you're going through each one of these and you're talking to them and you're eliminating certain people for a whole bunch of different reasons. Maybe somebody's deceased, maybe they're in jail, maybe it's the wrong gender, a whole bunch of different reasons until finally you get it to a point where you've got a single line and you start narrowing it down, narrowing it down, narrowing it down. So the amount of work, but for people who load this DNA, their DNA onto a site, is that they're all saying, I want to help. Why wouldn't I? Because it doesn't involve them. It doesn't involve their close family members. It involves somebody who's committed a crime, and in this case, again, it's at the closest here was at the great-great-grandparent level and probably a fourth cousin removed. So it's way out distance, is that these people don't even know each other.
What was her reaction, how long? I mean,
She wanted to help. She was extremely cooperative and very interested in cooperating. Same with the woman in Iowa, same with the woman down in Venice. As we were talking, I've just given you examples of just really a few. I mean, seriously, a few of the people that our investigators talked to, interviewed, knocked on doors, visited with, and that went through with FDLE to just keep chipping away at this. But everybody's extremely cooperative because when you explain to them what you're doing, why you're doing it, and the nature of the investigation that you're conducting, is that nobody wants a guy like that on the street who is really violently raped 2 women, and nobody wants to see him get away with it. So they were extremely cooperative in the investigative process and trying to help us out.
Any chance with this, Robert Brian Thomas, you guys linked him to 2 rapes, any others that might be in Michigan or anywhere else?
Well, not that we know about. If there were, certainly we would charge them. And again, and part of this was occurring, but again, back at the time, one of the challenges with this, you don't know what you don't know. Is there somebody else out there, as an example, that was booked into some jail somewhere at some time, or anyone of them, anyway, a myriad of circumstances, you just don't know. And so you just don't know. This is the only 2 that we have him identified in, and we have probable cause for his arrest. I'll leave it there.
Another question for you, Sheriff, and for gentlemen with FDLE. I think this is interesting. For a long time, this has been a hobby for families to trace back their ancestry. Most of y'all have done this well. Did you ever think genealogy would be used to capture criminals?
I hope. I don't know, Donna or Bert, you want to talk to that?
I never thought it would, no, but it's impressive stuff. Like the sheriff said, that they went through 90 suspects prior that they eliminated before we got to this gentleman. Again, it goes back to just old-fashioned police work. FDLE would provide the detectives a lead and a tip, hey, you might want to go down this path, and they would. And the results speak for themselves. But no, I never thought that we'd be talking about this, no. And our coordinator for our genealogy team, Lori Napolitano was her name, she got into this as a hobby and wanted to find her own lineage, and that's what turned it into a passion for her. And now solving these cases has made it even more a passion for her.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the unit, like how many people are in it?
There's 4 total, and they're based in Orlando, and they've been in operation for about a year. And we've solved some cases on the east coast of Florida, and this is the first one, like the sheriff said, in Pinellas County. And they're very busy.
All right, thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you.